check over here. There it is. Okay. Wait, how do I go to my... Oh. There we go. Alright, cool. Okay. Any questions before we get back into stuff today? Cool. Right, so I'm pretty sure this is where we ended for you guys. Europeans getting into West Africa and all of this that was happening. These very strange artistic representations. Which was a decent place to end because then we can move on to North America. And that'll be what we'll talk about today. So, just to recap last time, the changeover from Europeans being more familiar with like Egypt and North Africa and the Muslim kingdoms there, and then into West Africa and the more tribal Africans and the slaves that were taken in, tribal warfare. And the slavery there was still more similar to the bound labor that had already been happening in Europe for centuries, which was usually temporary. It wasn't like something that was passed on from family to family. It wasn't, something that was considered, well, I don't know, it depended on where you were, because, the Slavic people were still seen as, like, lesser than, like the British or whatever, but it wasn't what we'd eventually have with the Atlantic slave trade. We're getting in that direction. But let's take a step away from that and get into what would eventually get to some genocide. So, now, we should make a quick note. The first Europeans to actually get across the Atlantic were the Norsemen, the Vikings. Around 1000 CE, Eric the Red made it to Iceland and Greenland, but Leif Erikson was the first one to actually make it to Newfoundland. So there were some Viking settlements in modern-day Canada. However, by around the mid-1400s, the little ice age hit, and a lot of that area was frozen over, so they weren't able to really grow anything, and they abandoned it and just came back to Scandinavia. Well, they were living in England by then, but they didn't really share any of this discovery with anybody, so nobody really knew about it. But we do have evidence that this happened. Of course, the big start that everybody knows about was the navigator from Genoa, Christopher Columbus, getting Spain to pay for all his stuff to head across the Atlantic in 1492, because, as we've mentioned, you can't really do anything in the Mediterranean because the Italian city-states are in control of that, and going around the southern tip of Africa is now Portugal's thing, so you can't really do that, so let's try something else. Now, I don't know if you folks are aware. Once again, nobody back then thought that the world was flat and that if you went west, you'd fall off the edge. Um, Only people today are that dumb. Um, However, Christopher Columbus was wrong in that he thought that the world was smaller than it is. He figured you could go west and then you'd end up in Asia pretty quick. Um, in fact, had he not accidentally run across the Caribbean, um, either he and his crew would have simply died for running out of supplies, or more likely, they would have mutinied, thrown him overboard, and come back home. And they were about to before they spotted land. They just got lucky that there happened to be a landmass significantly closer to Europe than any of the islands out of the Pacific, because the Pacific was substantially larger. And as I'm going to show you guys towards the end of class today, it's a hell of a trip across the Pacific. It took a little over a month to get across the Atlantic. And when you're on, a wooden sailing ship and you've only got enough supplies to hope for the best, and there's no kind of refrigeration, the best you can do is salt it, and even that's not going to do a whole lot. It starts to get a little worrying after a couple of weeks. So, they arrived at an island which Columbus quickly named San Salvador, which is to say his salvation, because he wasn't about to get chopped up and thrown overboard as chum. Now, he had read quite a lot about Marco Polo's trip to China and India, and about all the various highly advanced civilizations there and all their riches and whatnot. And, looking at a map, if you were to go west and come back around to the east, you're going to hit like Japan and China first, and then eventually India. None of the natives in the Caribbean looked anything like what Marco Polo had described. But Columbus is like, no, we're totally in Japan and China. It's fine, guys. Don't worry about it. So the Pope, eventually, though, they realized they had maybe discovered some new stuff. And the Pope said everything that was over there was Spanish land. And then Portugal got all pissy, so they gave everything east of the Cape Verde Islands, which is out in the Atlantic, to Portugal, and they eventually discovered that, hey, Brazil's out here, because they obviously can't tell what's hundreds of miles away. Anyway, eventually that's why Portugal got Brazil. That's why Brazil speaks Portuguese today, is because of this compromise with the Pope. So there's the Norsemen doing their thing. They came overseas in this thing. The longboats were pretty good. Also, they were coming across the northern Atlantic, so they could stop off in Iceland and then Greenland, and then it was a relatively short hop to Newfoundland from Greenland, compared to. I've got some maps in a little bit to show you guys, compared to the just coming straight across the Atlantic. But still, coming across any amount of water in one of those long ships. Brave souls. Anyway, there's Columbus, totally not about to do a genocide. Queen Isabella. Oh, I didn't mention. So Isabella, yeah. So at this time, Spain had just unified. It was a bunch of different, kingdoms at the time. And it had just unified, and Queen Isabella maintained a lot of her power. So it wasn't like the king was in charge and she was just sort of there. They shared power. So she was really the one that made the decision to give funds to Columbus, and Ferdinand was just like, yeah, okay, that's fine, I guess. Um, and she's known throughout history as being one of the more powerful queens, um, until we get to, like, Elizabeth, and she did a whole lot herself. Um, and I don't have the source on this, but this was around the time when the Queen piece in chess became what it is today, and that it can do all the moves, rather than just, yeah, I think before it could just move like the king, where it can move one move in every direction, as opposed to like all the way across the board. So yeah, Isabella was something else. Here are the demarcation lines. You can see the Cape Verde Islands were way out here, and eventually they moved the line further west. And then when they did some more exploring, they realized, oh hey, there's a lot of land out here. Actually, I should point with the mouse because I've got to align people. Where's the mouse? There we go. Yeah. So they're over here, discovering all this land, not realizing there's all this happening. So Portugal got to get their hands on this, which actually had quite a bit of silver mines to it, and we'll talk about that later. All right. So Columbus went back to the Caribbean 2 more times, get more land, instituted a system of Incin meas. Men in the expedition received land, and the natives provided labor. This was supposed to be sort of like the vassalage system from medieval Europe, where the lords or the expedition leaders would protect the natives, and the natives would provide labor in return. In reality, it was just slavery, and they worked the natives to death. As often would happen in the Americas. In fact, Columbus bungled this so badly that by the time he died in 1506, he had been called back to Spain and thrown into prison for his various crimes. Yeah, people talk. There are some folks that are like, "Oh, you're trying to judge Columbus based on modern day morality." It's like, no, he was judged based on the morality of back then, and they threw him in prison because of the genocide he was doing. And considering we're going to look at other people doing that on greater scales, I don't know. It was, I guess, because he was murdering people who weren't even fighting back. So by this point, nobody believed they were actually in China. But they did realize, hey, we've got all this new land that nobody's discovered before, except all the people that are actually here, but we'll ignore that. So all the big countries started sending explorers. 1497, John Cabot, or his actual last name Caboto, because of course he was from Italy as well. In fact, he was also from Genoa. He was hired by England to explore further north. He he charted out eastern Canada, and then England's like, okay, cool, and did nothing for another 100 years. I mean, what was England doing in the 1500s? Oh yeah, the 100 Years' War. I know, they were done with it by then. I don't know what they were doing in the 1500s. Probably some civil war or something of theirs. So yeah, they didn't do anything for a while. For the most part, it was the Portuguese and the Spanish. They're really going to be the main ones we're going to talk about um, for the rest of today. In fact, we're going to end um, just before we move on to what France was doing, which is right near the end of the chapter. We'll talk about that next week. So the Portuguese and Spanish were the ones really pushing into the Caribbean. Amerigo Vespucci, another Italian man, in fact, he was from the Italian city-state of Florence. He wasn't really he wasn't an explorer on his own, but he went with a number of explorations and did a lot of. He wrote a lot of very vivid accounts of what he was seeing and sent those back to Europe. And so people were able to experience these new discoveries through his writings. And apparently they were so vivid and so exciting that the map maker, Martin Walsemuller, who, if you can tell from the name, was German, dubbed the new continent, which was technically South America, America. Which is also weird that he used the guy's first name, which is uncommon. Because another name for the Americas was Colombia, which is the feminized version of Columbus, and that's, using the guy's last name, which is more normal. So I guess it's lucky that Walsemuller decided to use Amerigo as opposed to Vespucci. I don't know. That one caught on. But I guess if we had several hundred years of it, like North and South Vespuccia, it would just be normal for us. Anyway, this is what the incognitos were. This is something I learned about when I was in grad school. It was the Protestant Reformation course, because since I was being taught at a school where they trained Catholic friars, and my professor was a Catholic friar, we also talked about the Catholic Counter-Reformation and the Jesuits and stuff. So we also talked about this. So yeah, again, the idea was, I keep pointing at it with my hand, but I got to remember, I've got my online people, sorry guys. The idea was that the Spanish would protect, care for, and Christianize the natives, and the natives would work a portion of their time for the Spanish settlers. Sort of even. But what actually happened is that the Spanish made them work long labor, didn't pay them, didn't protect them, and seized their land, and then the natives died from starvation and working to death. Eventually, this isn't really important for us. This just happens later. This was something that we did talk about in great detail in my class, though. There was eventually clergy protests and native revolts. Actually, I think we do end up talking about the guy that, we don't talk about it today, but anyway, there were clergy protests, and the incognitos were gotten rid of, but then they were replaced with the repartimento, which were they just ended up being the same thing. So, nothing changed. They just renamed it. Oh, there's the map I was looking at. Yeah. So yeah, Eric the Red got to Iceland and Greenland, which, if you can tell from the map, they specifically named them in reverse because the Vikings were dicks. They did literally name them in reverse so that if their rivals found their maps, they'd be like, oh, this one's got ice, so let's avoid it, and we'll go to the one with all the green. And haha, I gotcha. Like that is that is what happened. I'm not making a joke. Anyway, and then Leif Erikson just like went up the coast and went further west. Was like, oh hey, look guys, there's more land here, and then went on down and found new land, and therefore he named it Newfoundland. They are really creative with their naming. And then John Cabot just like straight across, which is, as you can see, a bit further than just going across here. And, you know, what would be from like Spain to the Caribbean is substantially further than from Britain to like here. But yeah. So the Vikings, while they were up in the freaking cold, it was certainly less distance to travel. These are the voyages of, I think this was Vespucci, because he was very much down in the south. I mean, they got really far down South America. Never really quite rounded it. That's for later. Oh, these are cool. I don't know if you guys are as weird as I am, but the evolution of maps, and this is actually neat because it is curved like that because you know it's hard to do a 3D globe on a flat plane. But this is showing what they're aware of and how detailed it is because you know you can only map based on what you're sailing around. So obviously, again, I'm physically pointing at it. Obviously, Europe is pretty much perfect because that's where they all live. Africa's a little bloated. They've got the east coast of South America. They've got the Caribbean, and they've kind of got the east coast here, but there's not been much sailing going on up there yet. Over here is just a mess. Like, they know there's islands. They know there's land-ish, but that's about it. You sort of got Saudi Arabia here as well. But that's it. And I'm going to show you guys another map a little bit later to show you how much it advances in just, well, I don't know how many years. I don't have many years on these things. But the maps are neat because obviously they don't have any kind of like satellite imagery. Map making's wild when all you're doing is sailing around and just like sketching it as you go. It hurts my brain. So, while this is going on, we have Vasco Núñez de Balboa going across the Isthmus of Darien, which is modern-day Panama, and became the first European to see the Pacific Ocean. I guess we're not counting Marco Polo because he very clearly saw the Pacific Ocean while he was over in China, but whatever. Juan Ponce de Leon found Florida, so that's cool. I'm going to talk more about Magellan at the end of class because there's a video I want to show you guys, but I'd have to change the stream around a little bit, and that might take extra time. And B, there's a chance that I might get a copyright strike on the video, and I don't want that to like mute the stream halfway through. So if it like mutes it at the end of the stream, it's not that big a deal. So we'll do it at the end. Anyway, Magellan. The book gives us a paragraph. He deserves more than that. So left from Spain in 1519. And his intention was to go around the globe. He was going to prove once and for all you can go west and then come back from the east. It was hell. They dealt with scurvy, hostile natives, bad weather, and open mutiny before even getting past South America. And that was like not even the halfway point. Eventually, they arrived in the Philippines in March of 1821, and Magellan was killed by the natives. But one of his 5 ships and 18 men managed to get back to Spain in September of 1522, 3 years later, but it was loaded with valuable spices and did allow Spain to claim the Philippines because they were there at one point and there's now a dead body on the Philippines, so now it's theirs, I guess. Finders keepers. So good for them. So Magellan didn't make it, but his crew did. Well, 18 of his crew did. Yeah, that's the kind of victory in several of my games where everybody complains to you afterwards. It's like, we can't keep having victories like that where you lose most of the men. Like, there's 18 guys left out of 5 ships. Come on, man. It's like, well, Magellan wasn't around for them to complain to, so whatever. Anyway, I've got the link for when I put it up on Blackboard if you guys want to watch it. If my online people aren't able to see it, they'll be able to check the video later. And you guys will as well, because like I said, I'll put this up probably today. But we'll watch the video at the end. It's like 2 minutes. It's not a huge thing, but I still want to do it. It's like my favorite thing about this time period. All right. So real quick, we got Balboa's route. He went across the Isthmus of Panama and was like, oh, hey, there's a whole freaking ocean over here. Cool. And he named it the Pacific Ocean because it's so peaceful, clearly having not been to the rest of the Pacific Ocean, which is not peaceful. It's like, oh, this part's great. It's so peaceful. It's like, because it's in a freaking bay, dude. It's like, yeah, the Gulf of Mexico is relatively peaceful when there's not a hurricane in it. Anyway, there's Ponce de Leon. And by discovering Florida, we mean he, like, looked at Florida from the boat and went back to Puerto Rico. St. Augustine will be important later. Here's Magellan's travels. They stopped over the Canary Islands, which is like a major stopping point for both the Spanish and the Portuguese. Magellan was Portuguese, by the way. Made their way down to the All Saints Strait. Now I think it's called Saint Strait of Magellan. So, got named after him. This was where the mutiny happened. It's also very cold down here because notice it's near Antarctica. Made their way back up. Found a couple of islands. Got to the Philippines and he got stabbed. And then the rest of his crew made their way down. Found the Cape of Good Hope. They were glad to be in relatively familiar waters. And then returned to Spain by 1522. Almost 3 years. They made it back on September 6th, just a few days before the 3rd anniversary of when they left, September 20th. So that's actually quite interesting. Slight spoiler on what the video is going to be. If you don't know what this is, don't worry about it. You'll know by the end of it. All right. Very important. Making, printing, and distributing maps were part of the printing revolution. Obviously, China had the first woodblock printing way back in like the 900s. Johann Gutenberg did not invent the printing press. He took the idea from China, and instead of using Chinese characters, he used characters that were used in Europe. And over the course of 3 years, used this movable type print to create 180 copies of the Bible, and then the second thing that was used, that the printing press was used to print, was porn. And then something happened, and he lost his license, and all his stuff was taken by the government and spread all throughout Europe. So everybody had access to the printing press. He made almost no money off this, though. So with this spread all throughout Europe, they were able to print these journals and maps relatively cheaply and easily. I mean, they were still not, dirt cheap. But you could get your hands on them far more cheaply than back when everything was handwritten. So they could be circulated among scholars and rulers, and this increased the interest in the New World. I mean, as long as you could read, which, literacy wasn't very high, but anyone that was literate was able to learn about new discoveries and not just read about them, but see the new updated maps, which I'll have some here in just a minute. And just going back to the natives real quick, it mentions that they had their own ways of charting lands. The Maya had glyphs. These stones called stela. Obviously, the Maya Aztecs, or the native groups, had maps and stuff as well. Actually, let's see. Oh, no, that's a German map. Okay, never mind. This was the movable print for the Chinese printing press. So you didn't have to have the entire thing. You could have each individual letter or character. And this was what a typical printing press shop looked like in Europe. You had each individual letter that you could put in, lock into place. Then you'd put the ink on it with those weird little blotter things. They were like these rubber balls on handles. Actually, they were probably leather, now that I think about it. Rubber wasn't especially easy to get your hands on. And then you would put that die onto the press, and then you'd have to have some big dude, because apparently these things weren't especially well optimized. And then you'd mash it down on the paper, and you'd be able to make the page. And here's a more updated map. As you can see, it's far closer to a modern interpretation. It's still a little wonky in terms of where things are, but as you can see, even the equator is a little bit weird. So it's not one-to-one. But again, Europe's in good shape. Africa looks a lot closer to how it's supposed to look. Asia looks a little bit better. We've even got Indonesia over here, or the Southeast Asia, rather. North America is still a little confused. They don't know what's inland yet. South America is kind of bloated, but they've got all these river systems they've found along the way. So yeah, it's pretty cool. They're still not sure what's down here. This incognito, we don't know what's further south because it's cold and we don't want to go there. I mean, even like the modern maps we have in the book aren't technically 100% because they're flat, and like a proper map on a 2D plane is going to be a little bit distorted to make up for the curve. All right. So, as I mentioned, another name for the Americas was Colombia. That's the like feminine um, name for Columbus. That was just sort of the generalized term for the Americas. It's still kind of used for the United States sometimes, or just even the Americas sometimes. That's why like our state capital is Columbia. That's why you'll sometimes have like there's a company Columbia Records. Um, that's why there's the country in South America called Colombia. That's just why that term is still thrown around today. It's just another term for America. Um, anyway, as you probably are aware, with the Spaniards making their conquest, they were aided largely by disease, because the Europeans had all sorts of stuff that the natives had never experienced, and therefore their immune systems had no kind of defense against it. And the numbers are horrifically devastating. The Incan Empire went from 9 million in 1530 to less than half a million within 100 years. I mean, it's not like... When we talk about the Black Death in Europe, I mean, it's devastating. They lost like half of their people. And that's hard to imagine. It's just like half of the people you know gone. This is more than 90%. This is 9 out of 10 people gone. And this wasn't just like a disease swept through and they couldn't do anything about it. A disease was sweeping through while a civil war was happening, while they were being invaded by an outside nation. They were destroyed completely. And not just the Incas, obviously. Aztecs and Maya, 40 million total, went to about 3 million by 1650. Again, less than a tenth. And this was the so-called Columbian Exchange, transfer of disease, flora, and fauna between the Americas, Africa, and Europe. And as I said, this disease spread and the demographic change was more devastating than the Black Plague because, again, it didn't wipe out half of the population. It wiped out nearly all of them. There's actually been relatively recent studies about groups of natives that were further inland in North America that got hit by diseases that the Europeans weren't even aware of, that had like cleared out large sections of forest, and they had relatively large settlements. And forests keep the areas cool, and large clearings heat the area up. I mean, that's why cities are so damn hot. One of the reasons why cities are so damn hot. And actually, this event caused worldwide temperatures to drop slightly because so many people died and so many areas became overgrown that had once been used for places for people to live. It's hard to put into words. And this again is why slaves were brought from Africa over to the Americas, and in particular the Caribbean, because they were partially immune to a lot of these diseases, in particular malaria and yellow fever, due to Africa itself being full of all sorts of fun diseases, and surviving there at all meant you had to have a hell of an immune system. So they were being used as laborers simply because they were able to survive. Also, Europeans introduced pigs and iron to America that had not been there before. Also, horses, as I mentioned before, horses were not native to America. Actually, quite a few things. I'll show that in a minute. Want to bring a map up. And besides the gold that was being stolen from the larger empires, maize, potatoes, tobacco, cocoa, sugar. Well, sugar was developed in Asia, but was largely grown in the Caribbean. All these other things, though, had never been seen in Europe before and were taken from America and introduced to European people. So potatoes, not an Irish thing. It's an American thing. Tobacco is American. So are tomatoes. And in fact, tomatoes were seen as toxic for a while, for a couple of reasons. One is related to the nightshade plant, which, if you know what nightshade is, yeah, nightshade is an extremely poisonous flower. It's literally called the deadly nightshade. But also because the people who could afford getting their hands on the exotic exports from America usually had fancy plates, and the fancy plates were usually made out of pewter. And pewter has a hell of a lot of lead in it. Normally not a big deal, except the acidity in the tomatoes would pull the lead out of that pewter, and suddenly they were getting a whole lot of lead in their diet. And lead's not good for you. So that was fun. So tomatoes killed a lot of nobles. Do well. So this eventually resulted in what we will see in later chapters as the triangular trade. Labor from Africa to provide raw resources in America to send to Europe. And then eventually Europe is going to create finished products out of that to send back to America once America has colonies to send that to. So we've got here the various things being brought from America, various things going from Europe, Africa, and Asia to the Americas. Again, cattle, sheep, pigs, and horses were not native to the Americas. And then we've got all these lovely diseases being brought to the Americas as well. Coffee isn't from the Americas. We've got the various grains that weren't from the Americas. Also, all the wild boars we're dealing with here in the States, yeah, those are just pigs that got loose and went feral. Like pigs are weird like that. You can just have a regular pink happy pig, and if it gets loose and goes in the woods, and I'm not sure how long it takes, but it will just grow bristly hair and tusks, and pigs are weird. Okay, let's get a little further so that I can show you guys that really important documentary, and then we can be done before the hurricane gets us. It's not a hurricane, it's a tropical storm. All right. So the French and English didn't really have a whole lot going on in North America. That's going to be next chapter. Spain is doing a whole lot. They are taking so much gold they broke the European economy. And because it takes like a month to get across the Atlantic, the Spanish crown was giving the people who were running the expeditions just give them land and they can do what they need to do. Basically, again, these incognita systems which hadn't ended yet. That slide I showed you was a little future peek there. However, the leaders would further divide up this land among the men in their group and give them authority they technically didn't have, but, whatever. So getting into the nitty-gritty, Diego de Velasquez, whatever, he's not super important. He was in charge of Cuba, gave Hernan Cortez, Hernan Cortez, it doesn't really matter, it's Cortez. He could head down into South America and trade, but he probably shouldn't genocide anybody. And then Cortez proceeded to head into where the Aztecs were, forming alliances, and eventually worked to overthrow the chief Montezuma and genocided the Aztecs. Largely aided by smallpox because, European disease. Now, as we mentioned, the Aztec cities, especially their capital, was massive and very advanced. A lot of the Spanish soldiers wrote back about marching into the city that it didn't feel real, that they thought maybe they were dreaming or hallucinating, and they compared it to Venice, which was the most advanced European city of the day. So they were comparing what they felt was, some backward, savage civilization's city to what to them was the most advanced civilization or the most advanced city in the world. So, they couldn't comprehend. It's like, these people aren't supposed to be advanced, but yet we're seeing the city that we can only compare to the greatest city our people can make. And not even our people, not the Spanish, but the Italians. And the Italians are way ahead of the Spanish at this time in terms of technology. So, yeah. And then Cortez is like, well, they're all dying of smallpox, so we're going to tear the city down and build Mexico City. I'll get to the lake in just a minute. Also, we're just going to pop in Francisco Pizarro down here at the bottom. He did basically the same thing, but to the Incas. Very, very similar. Smallpox. There were rival groups vying for power. So he, worked with groups within the Incas to overthrow the leader, and then everybody died except for the Spanish. And one of the main reasons was this. They marched through, left, and then came back. And by the time they came back, everybody was dying of smallpox. And here we have a depiction of the battle. I don't know what this little ship's supposed to be. It's very, very tiny. And there they are murdering Montezuma. And there's Pizarro's route, just like along the coast, spreading disease. murdering people. So, real quick, I said I was going to mention the lake in the Aztec capital. So, the Aztecs, because they just had like ridiculous amount of surface gold, they made just about everything out of gold. Gold is, really soft, relatively speaking, very easy to work into stuff, and it's shiny. So, humans are like crows. We like shiny things. And because it was so common, the Aztecs didn't place a huge value on gold. Like, they knew it was nice and easy to make stuff out of. So, pretty regularly, they would make like some kind of trinket out of gold and offer it to their gods by throwing it into this lake. And the Spanish found out about this and tried to go into the lake and get this stuff out. And I don't know what it was about this lake, but it killed a lot of Spanish. I don't know if like the lake, the bottom was really muddy or what, but I don't think they got any gold out, but the lake kept a lot of Spanish bodies. And then later, after the Mexican government was created, they decided they were going to drain the lake and get the gold out. And it still killed a bunch of people. So I guess the moral of the story is don't mess with ancient Aztec gold. Leave it in the lake. Yeah, the main thing here was just remember which tribe Cortez did a genocide on and which tribe Pizarro did a genocide on. Because that's easy multiple choice. All right. I think this is the last thing I want to talk about before we do, because yesterday we had a power outage right in the middle of my class, and that slowed things down a little bit. So I don't want to get ahead of that class, especially since we're not going to have that class tomorrow. We're not going to be here tomorrow. So, hurricane. Right. So since the Spanish were able to just like take gold from the various civilizations in Central and South America, they figured, hey, we can just do that everywhere else, right? So they began to head north into North America in the mid-1500s, searching for this, just more gold. Now, quick geography question for you guys. If they're in, Mexico, basically, and they head directly north into North America, what kind of land are they going to find? Say that again? I heard it. Say it, you were right.
Somebody said desert behind.
Desert. It's just going to be desert. It's just going to be sandy, hot, awful desert. They're going to find out no food. They're going to get sick because any of the water they're going to find is not going to be real good for drinking. And the natives that are there are not going to be happy that the Spanish are messing with them. So it didn't go so well. However, some of the explorers were able to see in the distance the Pueblo cities built into the cliffs. And they thought, hey, if there's cities built into the cliffs, they must have lots of riches. So eventually, Francisco Vasquez de Coronado went north in 1540 to try and steal the gold from the Pueblo that certainly would be there. I think this was... No, wrong thing. found nothing but small villages, so he just murdered a bunch of them and then went home. Hernando de Soto, he's got a fun little fail story here. So he went up through Florida in 1539. Again, I'm only just giving you guys these years for when stuff's going on. So about the same time as Vasquez, but it takes much longer. So they go up through Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas on foot. And on the way back, they run into Chief Tuscaloosa and his boys. And the boys give De Soto and his men a right trouncing. Now, rather than going back to their supply ships and, tending to the wounded and going home and just putting all this behind them, De Soto decided that would be embarrassing. So they went the opposite direction of the supply ships and, once again, on foot, went through Tennessee, Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Texas, and in 1541, 2 years after this thing started, became the first Europeans to report seeing the Mississippi River. Also, De Soto died around this time, so some other dude had to lead them. This whole thing was a complete failure because they didn't find any riches, and I think De Soto might have been looking for the Fountain of Youth or something. But once again, because Spain's weird, they're like, hey, this guy set foot on this land, therefore we're claiming it. And also they were exposing these tribes to disease by being there, so that helped the Spanish in the long run. But in the short run, it was just a complete failure. And again, it's just amusing to me that, man, we got our butts kicked. Let's not go home. Let's go in the other direction and walk across half the United States. Or just, again, this uncharted land that no Europeans have ever been through. Anyway, there's Coronado's exploration, which is to say just bullying a bunch of Pueblo. There's Chief Tuscaloosa. Why put an extra K in there? Sorry, sir. You deserve better than that. You beat up a bunch of Spanish. Very funny. Here's this meandering trip. So yeah, they started down here and made their way up, all the way up through North Carolina. They got up to the Smokies. All right, we're gonna go home, and then they got the crap kicked out of them. And De Soto got butthurt. It was like, we're gonna go west, and they went west for 2 years, and then he died. He died when the red line ran out, and then some other dude had to led them all the way down to Texas, and they're like, nope, we're going back. They went back here, and then took the Mississippi River down, and then went back to Mexico. Because they've got bases in Mexico, and they're not doing that anymore. So yeah, that was a trip. Now, since our power didn't go out, we've got a little extra time. Let me try and get my stream to behave and get this video to work. Oh. All right. Let's first adjust this. Nope, that's personalized. Display settings. Duplicate. My shoes untied. Display capture. Why is it like this? There we go. Aha. All right. Okay. Now, it's time for Magellan.
There once was a man, his name was Magellan, a Portuguese skipper. The girls found him cute. He sailed with 5 ships to find the East Indies, then come back to Spain with a bounty of loot. Whoopee-tie-I-O, oh happy Magellan, starting your journey with hardly a care. Whoopee-tie-I-O, strong brave Magellan, you'll find the East Indies, you just don't know where. They crossed the Atlantic and spotted a country. Magellan said,
"It's the East Indies at last!"
but then someone shouted,
Hey, that's Argentina!
Magellan got cranky and chopped down the mast. Whoopee-tie-I-O. Settle down, Magellan. Put down that axe, there's no time to despair. Whoopee-tie-I-O, keep trying, Magellan. You'll find the East Indies, you just don't know where. A great storm arose in the mighty Pacific. The 5 little ships were diminished to 3. At last land was sighted, Magellan was happy, but then someone shouted, Hey, that's Chile! Whoopee-tie-I-O, cheer up, Magellan. Check out your map and don't tear out your hair. Whoopee-tie-I-O, keep trying, Magellan. You'll find the East Indies, you just don't know where. It took them 5 months, but they crossed the Pacific. They spotted a land that was dotted with palms. Magellan proclaimed,
Yes, that's the East Indies.
but then someone shouted,
Hey, I think that's Guam.
Ay, 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 ay. Oops, Magellan, your fun little journey's become a nightmare. Whoopee-tie-I-O, keep trying, Magellan. You'll find the East Indies, you just don't know where. They sailed due west to the Philippine Islands. Magellan was pleased as the natives drew near, but then someone shouted, I think they're attacking. Magellan said,
What?
And got hit by a spear. Whoopee-tie-I-O, farewell, Magellan. You almost made it, it's really not fair. Whoopee-tie-I-O, oh ghost of Magellan. The East Indies Islands were right over there.
Put that back up. Okay, so that is that. I will see you guys on Monday.